Hello and welcome to this episode of Pause with Nandini. Today, my guest is Dr. Aditya Sondhi, who is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. He's a scholar who frequently lectures on the application of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's constitutional philosophy in modern jurisprudence. He highlights Dr. Ambedkar's focus on constitutional morality, minority rights, and protecting the underdog, often examining how these principles are applied or misunderstood in Supreme Court judgments. We do this episode today in conjunction with Hindus for Human Rights for Dalit History Month, where we examine all the ways in which Dr. Ambedkar has had an impact on civil society, on the constitution, on the courts, and try and understand what the relevance is and the spread of impact across various facets of our lives. With that, I welcome Dr. Aditya Sondhi to the show.
Thank you for having me, Nandini.
Absolutely. Let's go right into it. If you could give us an overview. I know it's a long career that you have, so this might be a difficult question to summarize, but essentially your work in the space of constitutional morality as envisioned by Dr. Ambedkar.
Yeah, I'm usually loath to speak about my own work per se, and especially on something as complex as the concept of constitutional morality is going to need a longish answer. But to illustrate the point, I think to understand how Dr. Ambedkar viewed constitutional morality, we have to understand him and his personality quite differently. And I had recently spoken, in fact, in Melbourne at a PATCA conference on how Dr. Ambedkar had been applied and understood and at times misunderstood in judgments of the Supreme Court of India. And there, in the context of constitutional morality, I tried to develop a theory that ultimately what he intended by that principle was that when the court is interpreting any scenario, there is always an underdog in the fight. And that underdog could be, a citizen, a woman, of course, a scheduled caste person, a minority, but could also be a region or a state fighting the center, and so on. But where that balance of power is slightly skewed, and courts are required to interpret the constitution, then they ought to be guided by this concept of constitutional morality, which transcends societal morality and the plain text of the constitution. So, using that analogy, maybe I can tell you a little about a recent case that I was arguing relating to an encounter killing by the police. And in case your audience is not familiar with this concept, there are instances where uh, accused in police custody find themselves, shot to death, right? And there are instances where that has been regarded as fake encounters, where the accused have been basically put to death by the police without trial, and other cases which are bona fide encounter cases where the police was acting in self defense. But the rule of law has progressed now to a point where the Supreme Court has said that in every such case of an encounter killing where somebody dies while in custody, there ought to be a magisterial inquiry into the matter and also an FIR registered so as to investigate the role of the police in that particular encounter. And I was recently arguing a matter relating to one such instance in Karnataka, and that's where I think this 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 conflict between your personal morality, societal morality, and constitutional morality comes in. The concept of rule of law is constitutional morality, in my opinion, because it has to step above and apart from the rest. If you look at the facts of that case, your conscience would be shocked in the sense that the person who was encountered was accused of having sexually assaulted and murdered an innocent 5 year old child. But that said, that's not a carte blanche for the police to take the life of an accused, right? And the whole concept of due process and trial, etc., are built into rule of law. So one has to then push against the grain often in cases like this and argue that, despite societal prejudice, despite situations that are on the ground, rule of law mandates that in an independent inquiry takes place in this case, and all the more reason because it's often been found that encounters are fake. They're faked not only qua the accused, sometimes they're faked qua the identity itself. You could have an innocent arrested for an alleged offense and put to death, and that's not the regime you want to move towards. So that might, in a sense, illustrate the point, but you know one faces that, for example, even in death penalty cases. I appear in a number of cases for the accused in death penalty cases, and here again there is that conflict between personal societal morality, your professional ethics, and I suppose a larger constitutional morality question. Just recently you must have heard that the court in Madurai sentenced 9 police officers to death in the Satankulam case, and that was also incidentally a custodial death case. And as much as I welcome a conviction against the police, which is fairly rare in cases like this, if you hark back to the infamous case of the Mathura rape case, where the police officers were all acquitted by the Supreme Court with almost like a value judgment on the victim, these convictions are welcome. But at the same time, if we approach them from a constitutional morality case, and you look at how Indian jurisprudence is moving towards becoming de facto abolitionist on death penalties, and the Supreme Court almost always remitting sentences to life, then you have to view it from a very different lens, right? So I suppose in cases one tries to always invoke that principle. There are cases which are on relating to the hijab ban, as you're aware, the SIR matter relating to the cleanup of the voter roll, the Assam Foreigner Tribunal cases, all of which are live and ongoing, and I happen to appear in those cases. I suppose in all of those cases, one tries to approach the matter from the perspective of that underdog that I mentioned, right? So that underdog is then the under trial. It's that girl who's a first learner going to school with a condition that she can only go to school if she wears the hijab, failing which it's a sort of indirect discrimination against her for belonging to the Muslim community, or the SIR, where the small marginalized tribal voter who does not have a good enough file to remain in a voter list, or worse still, in the case of Tamil Nadu, for which I appear for a petitioner, a large number of them being migrant tribal communities, right? And away at the time when the SIR is happening. So it's almost a de facto, a fait accompli almost, that they're not going to be able to vote simply because they're not stationed in their villages at the time when the SIR is happening. And you can look at all of these cases that I've mentioned technically as per the law, or you can, rise above the law and look at them from a constitutional morality perspective to say what really is the intendment of this exercise and who is being hit by it at the end of the day, and how do the courts then try and protect those sort of invisible victims. Yeah.
Think those examples that you gave really illuminated the points that you were making. The question sort of in my head is that, are the courts really open to this perspective? And the other thing of how subjective then is this in its application? Because if it's about an interpretation of constitutional morality, it seems to me that there is a certain aspect of subjectivity in it, when you're thinking about the underdog taking on the big dog in a fight.
Yeah.
How uniformly do you think this can be applied, and is it?
I think it's going to be very hard to expect it to be applied uniformly, even on the same facts, right? The Indian Supreme Court does not sit and bank. We have 15, 16 on a day, 17 courts, even with benches of 2 or 3 judges, each of which is the Supreme Court of India. And while deciding cases, applying various tests under the Constitution, including those of constitutional morality. These questions don't come up every day, but when they do, they are addressed. But there's bound to be disparity of views, there's bound to be conflict, and there's bound to be conflict even on the same facts. As I speak to you now, we have a larger bench constituted of 9 judges in the Supreme Court to reconsider the Sabrimala judgment, which is on the question as to whether women have a right to visit the temple and pray or not. Is it gender discrimination, or is it a core religious customary practice that needs to be protected? With two conflicting and countervailing forces equally strong in their own merit, so to speak, but which could be viewed very differently from a constitutional morality perspective, which is to say, at the end of the day, can you afford to keep a willing, devout woman who wants to worship in this day and age under the Indian Constitution? But take it from me, this is never a straight line at all. It's bound to vary. It's bound to vary from bench to bench. And I have to say, it's bound to vary from time to time, and the frequency with which judgments are often reviewed or referred even to larger benches. Last week, there was a reference here on the interpretation of a judgment relating to the definition of industry under the Industrial Disputes Act, something that will interest you with your work around labor codes and so on. And Justice Krishna Iyer, who was an out and out socialist judge, had interpreted the word industry much more broadly to include, even the government in many circumstances, so as to give the benefits of labor legislation to all those who fell within that definition. But that's being re-looked at, and the judgment is awaited. But the point I'm making is that this is never a given in the system that we practice.
Has to be fought for, I suppose. One of the interesting things you said is that, someone is a socialist judge, right? And I'm thinking of, as you're speaking about all the variables in this process, one of those variables would also, I suppose, be the personal, political, or ideological leanings, right, of the magistrate or of the judge. And possibly in today's India, plays such a dominant role because as we're seeing the rise of the far right and all of those ideologies that globally seem to be converging and seem to be taking center stage, I wanted to talk about something that's been off and on in the news, but maybe doesn't really come to the center as much. In a 2020 article in Countercurrents, we're told that between 1989 and 2019, the Supreme Court has used Manusmriti in making their decisions in a total of 7 times. I don't have the number since then. Even the Chartered High Court of Bombay, Madras, Allahabad have referred to Manusmriti in various judgments. I was in an anti-caste symposium in Melbourne recently, and we had Advocate Arul Moji, who's the Public Engagement Secretary of Dravida Kazhagam, who also echoed in a similar sort of vein that she was quite surprised to see how often the Manusmriti seems to be coming up in courtrooms. If not as a legal basis, but at least as an ethical framework to justify certain rulings. What is your observation, and are there concerns of this becoming commonplace? And do you think it's a strategic sort of thrust to try and get more of that ideology into courtrooms?
Yeah. Look, I think this question has to be looked at in a more granular way.
Sure.
2089 to 2019 itself is a large span of time, which is 30 years, and it transcends many governments
Yeah.
that India has had, many judges and many courts. I am per se not averse to theological texts, philosophical texts, even spiritual writing, if the case requires, being referred to in cases. I don't think we should shy away from that. Dr. Ambedkar himself was a lateral thinker, and while being part of the Constituent Assembly, chose to borrow from multiple sources, right? So he welcomed a school of thought that need not strictly have been Indian or native in that sense. And he also was disgruntled with his own constitution, as Anand Teltumde writes, that in many ways he found it to be a compromise at the time. But thank God we had it, because if we didn't, then we'd go down a very different route, in a sense, like Pakistan has. But when theological texts start getting a lopsided amount of reliance, or become the sole basis for adjudication of constitutional questions, then I think we need to be alarmed. Referring to the Bible or the Quran or the Guru Granth Sahib or the Manusmriti or the Bhagavad Gita contextually while deciding a question of religious rights, of theological questions, which are not codified, which may then go into the realm of custom, etc., I think cannot be faulted. But the difficulty is that we often also equate the Manusmriti as being a Brahmanical text. Once you do that, then it takes me to the point that Professor Mohan Gopal made. In fact, other than, I don't know if the Countercurrents article refers to his work, but I was actually at that conference where he developed this to many stages further, which was to look at the dominance of the upper castes in the higher judiciary in Indian Supreme Court. How far does that indoctrinate or prejudice decision making? And if the Manusmriti fits in at that level, then there is cause for alarm. But from my experience, to be honest, and the judgments I've seen, there are instances where, unfortunately, judges have written orders to pander to a government, to pander to an ideology and almost score points. I've seen this especially with a couple of high court judgments. But by and large, I wouldn't say that the Indian Supreme Court is bound by or driven by the Manusmriti. Certainly not. Uh, there could be unsaid prejudices sometimes, which ties up with your earlier question, when you're deciding a matter of a religious nature, or even a caste issue, or you're deciding a matter on which a court has a different prejudice. It could be gender, or for that matter, look at the Section 377 judgment, where the Supreme Court initially said it was a storm in a teacup.
Yes.
The Supreme Court thought it was a non issue, right? But it again went through this process of reviews and curative petitions and larger benches that I was illustrating earlier, to arrive at a law which said that, consenting adults in private cannot be prosecuted. And if they are, then it becomes discrimination on the ground of sexuality. And that conversation is still on with the new transgender amendment bill, which has become the law in India. So to answer this, I would say one needs to look at it a lot more granularly to see if courts are literally being, driven by the Manusmriti. And my sense is that is not the case. There are a few exceptions which make me uncomfortable, though.
All right. In your podcast, which I thought was quite clever, that it's called Podcast with an E, focus being discussions around caste. One of your guests, Clifton de Rosario, quoted Mr. Bal Gopal, who's a human rights advocate in Hyderabad, who said, in India, caste is the law. And it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but what do you make of that comment, since you did speak a little bit of caste as one of the factors that has an intersectionality in the conversation that we were having? What do you make of that?
Look, firstly, Mr. Balagopal is more than a human rights lawyer. He's an activist and somebody who's walked the talk his entire life. And he knows what he's talking about. So when he says it, I think it's only partly tongue in cheek. It's probably his lived experience working with communities and sections of society. And I suppose he qualifies that in a context of saying access to justice. I mean, when we speak of the law in India, we have to begin with the question of access, and how much access and how far does one have access within the system. Practicing in the Supreme Court, you can see that access to justice is still a seriously uphill battle. And you have excellent pro bono lawyering and legal aid and so on. But that said, It's not that everyone can find a voice in the Supreme Court. So, for a marginalized group, for an Adivasi, for a rural Dalit woman, let us say, the law is the officer in front of them. The
Mm.
law is that station house officer in the police station or the tehsildar and no beyond. And at that level, the intersection of caste is, I think, much sharper because a lot of entitlement, your very entitlement to even be heard or recognized or be visible to the system, can often depend on the dominant caste group you belong to or don't. And if people in positions of power are from dominant castes, there's a good chance that those complaints are going unseen, right? So, in that sense, caste is the law, right? But when you scale it up, I think then we need to recalibrate it. Sometimes class can be law. When I speak of access to justice, um, it is certainly those who are wealthier and more powerful with an ability to engage more powerful and more prominent lawyers who have deeper bank balances and are able to fight out expensive and long drawn litigation and to withstand pressure many times depending on the types of cases you do, who have a greater shot at justice. So in that sense sometimes it's not just caste, it's class manifesting itself, right? And if you look at then again the diversity of people in power, something I spoke about a little earlier. How much diversity do we have on the bench, especially the high courts and the Supreme Court? We don't necessarily have an accurate representation of society when you look at gender. We have one woman judge in the Indian Supreme Court, right? And if one does the arithmetic, we have, I think, grossly inadequate or insufficient judges in the high courts and the Supreme Court belonging to the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, the women, to minorities, right? Let's not even get into other segments like, say, the queer groups and so on, or physically disabled groups, etc. I'm keeping that aside. So the moment that representation is skewed, then in many ways, again, you could say that, caste is the law. But I think that would be making certain far reaching presumptions, which I don't entirely subscribe to. It's not to say that belonging to an upper caste necessarily means you carry a caste prejudice. Some of the finest judgments you might see on anti discrimination, etc., come from shall we say dominant majoritarian groups, right? And parliament being the law making body, I think has a far better representation than say the IAS does, or in fact Indian media does, right? Or educational institutions. How many vice chancellors do you have who belong to marginalized groups? So I think Mr. Balgopal's comment is worthy of a thesis in itself, but I can see where he's coming from. He's coming from I think a structural perspective, and he's also, I think, coming from his lived experience of interacting with victims on the ground. And I'm afraid to say at that level, many times in the urban poor, the rural, and other I would say more extremely marginalized groups, I think caste does manifold itself in more apparent ways than others.
A really thoughtful answer. And I think this lens of at which level are you actually having an opportunity to interact with the law? I think that's a really critical part of this conversation. Um, I wanted to ask you, speaking of caste, and you've lectured around this, you speak about this. What are the ways in which caste is both invisibilized and pervasive in urban spaces? And, in the diaspora, this comes up quite repeatedly. And I have to say, in Australia, Hindus for Human Rights is working quite closely with other Ambedkarite groups to at least bring more awareness to this subject, because a lot of times there's denial around
Mhm.
being a factor at all. I was asked a question recently on an Ambedkarite podcast, and I'll send you the link to that. It's called Outcast. It's by two women who have started this podcast based in Sydney, Meenakshi and Apurva. And one of the questions was, why would the oppressor caste or class give up their privilege? And you hear it all the time in the diaspora, people will be like, oh, we have to do everything ourselves. We miss our maids, or, we miss the help. And really, what they miss is that, that inequality that allows the structure of sort of, if not overt oppression, but at least taking advantage of someone's need in that social structure. So why would they give that up? And there is this argument that nothing changes by itself or on the goodwill of people, and things have to change by force, or in this case by legislation. So what do you think is that intersection of rules and laws and society changing in the caste question? And would the oppressor caste give up their privilege?
Well, I cannot say the oppressor groups would give up their privilege for the asking. We're, what, now 78, 79 years into independence, and one hasn't seen that paradigm shift considerably enough for me to say that. In fact, anyone equating caste as privilege, I think, is tone deaf, or is indeed in such a privileged position that they can actually say that and get away with it. I don't see the privilege there. Being born into a certain group, I don't think is a privilege, or the idea of merit as we understand it, right? And that takes me to your question as to how caste is often invisible, and that is where it camouflages as occupation and class, doesn't it? And it does so across religions. I recently reviewed a book by Daniel Moinuddin called "This Is Where the Serpent Lives," and it's a writing about feudal society in Pakistan. And you see often enough caste coming up in Islam. And that's not new. Caste is apparent even in Christianity, in Sikhism. And it sometimes may camouflage itself based on stratas of society, the work you do, being an Ashrafi or a slightly wealthier Muslim as opposed to somebody who's, say, a carpenter or a cobbler. But the fact is, it is caste at its core, right? However, you may try and dress it up. So, for those who are missing maids, etc., and saying this in a slightly condescending way, there is, I think, a caste element to it. There's no, maybe it's subconscious. I'm not saying everyone is coming from a pernicious place, but then one ought to smell the coffee, right? You got to recognize it. We grew up, in a sense, oblivious to caste because of the privilege we had of going to good schools and universities, where in many ways caste was hidden from our everyday lives. But that's not to say it didn't exist, right? And how does it surface? In many ways, marriage, even renting out offices or homes, right? Food.
Food,
Societies would say we will rent to vegetarians alone,
that's a big one, yes.
right? I'm pretty certain there's a caste filter there playing willy-nilly. Educational institutions, you must have heard of the recent UGC regulations that the government brought in, which I thought was a big step forward. And credit to the union government to have brought them in. But within days, they were stayed in the Supreme Court, and they were challenged by upper caste students saying, we feel discriminated in an educational institution, which is a little rich, in my opinion. Right. And I thought it was a giant leap. And the Vemula Act that the state of Karnataka wants to introduce is along the same lines. And caste in universities, not just at a student level, but at a professorial level. And I'm fighting cases for professors at leading institutions, in the IIMs, for example, where you have but a handful of professors who either belong to the scheduled caste, or even if they don't, are Ambedkarite in their philosophy, right? As I said, you could be caste agnostic, you could be Brahmin and Ambedkarite, and good on you if that's your personality. And I've been fighting cases for them because they are at the receiving end sometimes of policies within their universities, being asked to take down Twitter accounts, suffering in terms of promotion, and in the name of merit, in the name of discipline, in the name of uniformity, right? So I think caste is there to behold in Indian society. There's no denying it at all, and many times in far more overt ways, right? I mean, every week I read of someone being assaulted, being murdered, a Dalit boy trying to ride a horse which he shouldn't have ridden,
Yes, yes,
trying to drink water from a public place, trying to enter a temple. I'm ashamed to say it.
yes.
I'm I have to say that people are fighting the good fight as well. But yeah, this is how it is. This is how it is.
This is how it is really telling because you would think like, 2026, we wouldn't need to have these conversations, at least around these very overt, in your face sort of things that are really like, so confronting, but it is how it is. I did want to speak a little bit about unions. And globally, you're seeing the power of unions, the relevance of unions is systemically being eroded, their powers are being diminished. What do you see the role of unions in challenging caste discrimination, given the change in economy, also so much of pivot towards a gig economy, people are not protected. You think about the Uberization of labor. And typically, the people who are enlisted as foot soldiers are the most marginalized, are the caste oppressed. They have little protections, leading these atomized sort of lives. We do have unions, but do you see from an Ambedkarite lens an evolving role for unions in this new India or even global?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I go into it, I permit me to say one thing in the context of my previous answer when I mentioned caste in Islam, because there's been one other significant development over the last few weeks at the Supreme Court, which is that the Supreme Court has said those converting out of Hinduism into, say, Christianity or Sikhism, Islam, whatever it may be, Buddhism, like Dr. Ambedkar himself did, are denied their scheduled caste status. This is a recent judgment, right? And the correctness of it, or otherwise apart, social realities tell you a very different story, right? And not only is there an element of caste in, I think, in almost all religions across the board, often following the Ambedkarite principle, people have chosen to convert out of Hinduism, right? To escape the caste barricades and the caste oppression, and especially turning Buddhist, which Dr. Ambedkar did in 56 in a very large and public ceremony. And to assume that that migration is going to wash away, your caste identity and all of the trappings that come with it, I think requires a great deal of reflection. And this is also a judgment of two judges of the Supreme Court. I'm pretty sure sooner rather than later, it's going to find its way to a larger bench. It's a constitutional question. But um, I would be much happier if this question is taken up not just by the courts, but taken up by governments and by civil society to look at very objectively where we are today. And I was, frankly, my first visit to Australia last year, and I don't know what you think about it, but I was moved by the emphasis on the First Peoples and the conversation around it, right? And some might say it's symbolic and so on, but I, as a first timer in Australia, I think I found that the conversation was real.
Yes.
And in fact, while I was there, the state of Victoria had enacted its legislation to recognize the introduction of policy making, right? The treaty, that's right. And I thought that was a big step forward. And I'm hoping that we can do that in India and not stay technical about it. But your question about unions is a difficult one. Look, from whatever little that I have read and understood about the working of trade unions in India, is that I think they're a fantastic conduit when it comes to workers' rights and class issues. But I'm afraid they have not acquitted themselves well enough when it comes to the caste question, or for that matter, the gender question, right? And I was reading Brinda Karat's memoirs recently, where she writes about, her early days working in unions, in communist groups, and so on, and where she felt alienated, and she felt alienated as a woman. And I have read elsewhere, and I cannot recall where, the fact that there has been a fair amount of caste discrimination within trade unions, even, because that comes from a very different place. And it's not necessary then that union work and caste related activism intersect in a very fair and equal way. And those dichotomies are there to see in many realms. I mean, I was reading uh, Malika Amar's book. She was Namdeo Dhasal's wife, Udvasta, which is a Marathi translation. And she writes about Namdeo Dhasal, who himself was such a strong voice and a poet and a thinker and a leader of the Dalit groups, and about how his personal life fell short. He
Oh, I
was
know
abusive.
that. As a poet myself, I do
Yeah.
that question.
So my point is that these infirmities are there, and even Aparna Vaidik's book on the revolutionaries,
Mm.
uh, you know, and about how they were gallant revolutionaries, and she talks about many of the unsung ones, not the ones that we know about well, but how many of them fell short when it came to addressing, say, caste or gender and others. So, can unions bell that cat, bridge that gap? I'm not sure, and I also think that unions have a lot on their plate. You spoke of the gig economy. You have a new set of labor codes in India. It's not entirely my area of work, so I can't comment on it so easily. But unions are fighting those battles as well. And also remember that many times unions are also both labor unions as also student unions are stepping stones to mainstream politics, right? They've historically been that way, which tells you that there are unions which may have their hearts in their right place when it comes to labor issues, but may otherwise be completely aligned with parochialism, with the
Yeah,
majoritarian right wing movement as well.
right.
So, can they be the answer? I'm not sure.
Combating caste. One of the interesting things I sort of was made aware of was I was at an anti-racism conference in Melbourne, and we had a union leader there, and she said, the way you guys in the activism, social justice space think about organizations, a union is very different because we represent people who come from various ideologies, and we
Yeah.
have find a common denominator with a view of a very specific mandate, which is to secure better rights for them, better labor conditions and all of that. So we are a little bit different, but sometimes, from our perspective, we kind of see them as allies. We see them as people who should work with us in social justice issues. So there is that little bit of difference. And I think you're right to say that it's a difficult question to answer, but I do think that there may be an opportunity to engage unions in this question of caste.
For sure.
Did want to ask a question related, perhaps, and maybe it's not, like you said, your area, but when I think about domestic workers, and this is something we don't normally talk about in mainstream spaces, so I definitely want to address that. Something related, perhaps, to the earlier questions. At a national level, while there is comprehensive legislation enacted to protect domestic workers separately, the central government, through the Ministry of Labor and Employment, has initiated steps towards formulating a national policy on domestic workers, which is at the draft stage. I don't know if any progress has been made on it. I'm not aware. What protections can be afforded to them, either under the law, under unions, in some space, in the spirit of Dr. Ambedkar's vision for the right to dignity?
Yeah. So we're now actually getting into the unorganized sector largely, and I'm afraid the formal legislative regime over labor law still alienates these groups by and large. It ties in with your question around gig workers as well, in a sense, right? And some states have stepped up and tried to legislate around them. And that has also been the challenge, I think, with domestic workers, because other than the 2008 Social Security Act, I'm not aware of any legislation which directly protects them or recognizes them even or sees them. And I
Right.
think that's what would pain Dr. Ambedkar the most, because if you're not even going to see your own citizens, right? His whole idea of social equality versus political equality, to go beyond that one person, one vote simplistic understanding of Indian society to
Yes.
looking at socio-economic equality, which was his mantra in many ways that actually transcended caste, and things that he said and wrote about women and the working class transcended caste, in my opinion. And that's where the law has fallen short. You're right, there is a national policy on the anvil, but it's yet to take shape. And even with the 2008 Act, there is, I think, a welfare board that is contemplated. And as has happened with the Construction Workers Act, which came into, which was a big step forward, by the way. I think that can become a good template to try and understand how these sectors can be addressed. There is a great deal to be said about the lack of implementation, right? Because it again reverts to the states and their willingness to set up welfare boards and implement these enactments. And I'm fighting, in fact, a couple of cases in the Supreme Court relating to the implementation of these construction workers legislations. And you see how much the dichotomy is from one state to the other, and how many years it took from a law in the book to becoming a law on the ground, right? Which could actually flesh out and hand out the benefits of that act. So I'm afraid with domestic workers, we're still at ground zero in that sense. You're at a policy level. It's probably a good case, I think, for a public interest litigation. Coming back to your first question on constitutional morality, this is exactly where the courts, I think, can step in. And not that they should legislate, but when a legislation is wanting or missing, then till such time, I think judicial orders can hold the field, as they often do,
Thinking.
and maybe address this issue.
I kind of thought of that also in the context of what you were saying, the intersections of various levels of being marginalized or being not seen. So there's caste, there's class, and there's gender. So of course, because majority of domestic workers are women, it sort of falls so much further down the pecking order of what is even considered worth talking about. So I thought it would be good to speak to you about that. What is it about? We're wrapping up, so I want to get some of the bigger questions. What is it about Dr. Ambedkar that inspires you? It might seem like a very foundational question, but you know, you're very well read. You've access to many different schools of thought. What is it particularly about Dr. Ambedkar that inspires you today?
Look, a couple of things. I think his being synonymous with the Indian Constitution, and something people may say, unfairly so, because there were many others, including women, right, who were part of the constitution making process, and they're all slowly beginning to get their due. But his being synonymous with the Indian constitutional ethos, I think, is a position that just springs out at me as being, shall we say, the best voice to listen to. And his multifaceted avatar. I mean, Dr. Ambedkar was so many people rolled into one, right? So many professions. He was an economist. He was a lawyer, he was a philosopher, right? Uh, he was a thinker at times, he was even an artist,
Mm.
and he was a parliamentarian, he was a political leader, he was a public speaker. And therefore, his persona, I think, is also something that screams out at me as being, this exemplar. Uh, I'm saying this very personally. But more than anything, Nandini, I think the fact that I bumped into caste pretty late in my life, right? I'm actually borrowing this phrase from T.M. Krishna. I had asked him this question once as to how did he develop his sharp sense of awareness of caste in his own profession, something we see in ours. And I miss saying this to you in my answer to how caste is invisible, and I have to say it here, is that caste manifests itself even in the legal profession in many ways, in terms of what chambers one joins. Often enough, seniors taking on juniors, belonging to their own comfort groups, shall we say. It's not obviously not written in, but it's there and one sees it. And I think having bumped into a lot of these things late and developed a consciousness late on it, I thought Dr. Ambedkar manifests, all those answers that I was looking for. And more than anything, I think simply a voice of conscience. And I have to say that say this at this moment that we're at right now, not just in India, but I think globally, with everything happening in Gaza, with the Iran war as we speak, and many many other crises I think that the world is facing. I think now more than ever there is a need for these individuals who have lived a life, driven almost maniacally by their conscience, at personal cost, at professional cost. And uh, this is a time actually to hear them. And I know we have camps, the Ambedkar camp and the Gandhi camp, and I've spent a fair amount of time looking at how Ambedkar differed from Gandhi, and very vocally so.
Yes.
Many issues, especially Gandhi's neglect, if you will, of the caste question, which is a fair criticism of Gandhi. But at this moment, I think we can take both. We need moral voices as much as we can find them, and I think therefore Ambedkar. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think sometimes all of these things that we are able to intellectualize, first they have to speak to our heart. And I think Ambedkar profoundly speaks to your heart. And I hope this message goes far and wide. So thank you so much for coming on this show and talking to us. And hopefully, we'll have an opportunity to maybe have a panel discussion with a lot of younger people who are in this movement with us in Australia. And perhaps if you're making a trip back, we could also have it in person. Thank you again for your time.
I look forward to that. Thank you very much, Nandini. Thank you.